And welcome to another Sunday morning with me. Quite a few things have appeared on the sort of rant sheet today, so I'm just going to dive straight in. So first up is somebody put a comment on one of the videos, I think it was last week's rant, where I sort of said silly little jacks, and said why do I keep bashing the 3.5mm or 5/8 of an inch jacks that appear on the new Roland boutique equipment and some other equipment as well. It's actually more that my comments come more from a point of view of serviceability and maintenance rather than they do from usability. I agree with the comments that the person made on the channel. You know, if you buy high quality cables, they give just as good a performance. Absolutely no dispute. The issue really is around the interface where the jack plugs into the equipment. Now, in my experience, the smaller jacks have more chance of detaching or becoming dry jointed or requiring maintenance than the 1/4 inch jacks do. The 1/4 inch jacks, in my experience, always take more punishment. In the good old days, the actual 1/4 inch jack itself was actually secured to the chassis of the unit, as opposed to just poking through the plastic of the unit. So you know, you got much more stability there when you're sort of pushing cables in and out. So from a gigging perspective, it made a hell of a lot more sense. And that's really where my comments stem from. They don't stem from the fact that the actual jack is rubbish, because it's purely not. And as I say, if you buy the right cables and the right connectors, you'll get a very good signal out of that particular equipment. It's more usability and long-term maintenance. I don't see the smaller jacks as durable as the 1/4 inch jacks over a long span. I mean, if you look at the legacy stuff I have set in my studio, virtually every piece of legacy tech I've got is all 1/4 inch jack, and they all work absolutely fine. Occasionally I have to take them to pieces and resolder the joint, but that really is very, very far between. So I just wanted to sort of clear that up, because I don't have a downer on small jacks because they're rubbish. It's purely a longer term maintenance thing with me. The other thing I had a really good whinge about last week was hardware support for Midi, and the fact that I was really struggling in the market space to find good quality hardware support for Midi. Now, I've had a number of people who have pinged me on the channel this week and said various bits and bobs. So, I use, as I had on screen last week, I had a Roland A80, which is a manual patch bay, which I've now installed in my studio. So that's one way I manage the MIDI interface in the studio itself. And then I use the Mark of the Unicorn Midi Express XT for my interface between my computer and Midi as well. Now, I use it because it's quite functional. However, it is rather clunky, and I have been looking for another such interface that I can expand. Now, the problem with the Midi, the Mark of the Unicorn XT, is it seems to be incredibly hard to get hold of now. So that sort of leads me to the conclusion that Mark of the Unicorn are probably phasing the unit out. The driver and firmware, the Clockworks firmware that comes with it, is slightly painful to use, but it does work. So I don't get me wrong on that. So it's and they seem to be putting more into the Express X128, which is the smaller version of the XT. So I'm not really sure where that range of products is going. Now, somebody else said to me about the Midi Sport 880. Now, the problem I've had with Midi Sport recently, and I've just had to get rid of a unit on eBay, which was Midi Sport. Maybe a few rants ago, you saw me sort of wave it around in front of the camera, saying perfectly serviceable tech, but I can't get the damn thing to work. Was a Midi Sport unit, an old Midi Sport unit, which, for whatever reason, I was struggling to get working on the Mac, on the latest version of the Mac OS. Now, having done some more research into that, one of the things I have found about these devices is that most modern USB manufacturers are now writing their software to be what they call class compliant, and a lot of the legacy stuff was never written to be class compliant. What that means is that you do have to have specifically written drivers for the technology itself, rather than having the technology being able to tell the operating system what it can do, which is what class compliance is all around. That's one of the issues with the Midi Sport ranges, the older Midi Sport ranges. It's not class compliant. The USB is not class compliant on it, and therefore it does need drivers. And the 8.8 is quite an old unit. They don't seem to sell it anymore, or I can't seem to find anywhere that stocks it brand new. You know, all the sort of standard sources I would go to buy that sort of hardware. So, you know, yes, it's probably a serviceable unit if you can get the drivers for it. You know, for Windows 10 and for the latest version of Mac OS, absolutely brilliant. If you can't, then you know you've got to sort of say your user life expectancy with that piece of equipment is going to be quite short, given the fact that, you know, Windows is now phasing out support for the older systems. Windows 7 is now the latest Microsoft that is supported, and that will start to phase out in the next few years. And similarly with Mac, the older operating systems on the Mac side are slowly going, and Mac are more aggressive than Microsoft are. The other interface I've seen numerous ones, but the other one that sort of keeps coming up is the Steinberg interface, which again you can no longer buy. Although it did look quite pretty, I have to be honest. I mean, I saw one in a studio many moons ago, and it was sort of a purpley, and it looked quite good. But the reason for bringing that up is that while I was doing some research this week on something else, I came across a new company which I've never heard of before, called iConnectivity. Okay, and they seem to be moving in and producing a lot of products in this MIDI space, in this MIDI hardware space, all about sort of you know, controlling your legacy tech, which I thought was quite, you know, given the rant I did last week about saying, come on guys, support us, all of a sudden there's this company pops up this week on one of the emails, and it seems to be doing the right stuff. Now, I've got some pictures of the unit. Unfortunately, they haven't come out particularly well on my printer, but that's the actual front of the unit, like so. There you go. You can see it. It's called the Mio, or Mii. I'm not sure how you pronounce that, from iConnectivity. And effectively, it's more like a networking hub than it is sort of a pure MIDI device, because it says you can control it from two computers. So it's obviously got software built in there that actually allows two computers to actually interact at the same time, which is quite interesting. Quite an interesting concept. The other thing about it, and again, I don't think this is going to come out particularly well because it was grey on black, and that's how the unit comes. But if you look over on this far side here on the unit itself, it's got an Ethernet port, so you can plug it into a localized network and actually control it from a network perspective rather than controlling it from a USB perspective. Now that actually has some serious advantages as we move forward, because that means you can actually operate your laptop wirelessly, or your computer wirelessly, and control the MIDI hardware. Quite what it will do to the latency, I don't know. I haven't got one of these, but believe me, it is actually quite top of the shopping list at the moment in terms of a little bit more research, and then probably I'll jump in. Unfortunately, they're not cheap. So the unit I saw was about €330, so that's probably dollar equivalent, and about 280 odd pounds. So it might be next month's purchase, not this month's. There is another photograph I've got here, which is a slightly nicer photograph of the unit itself. There you go. As you can see, 1U 19-inch rack. So there you go. That's the iConnectivity. And again, this is a class-compliant device, so you know, that will probably take me forward quite a long way, and allowed me to get rid of my Mark of the Unicorn device if it really does what it says. The other great thing about that device is the Mark of the Unicorn device I have is an 8x8. Sorry, it's a 9x8, as in 18's 9 outs. This is actually a 10x10. So it actually gives me a wider scope on the MIDI side of it, so a little bit more latitude in what I'm doing. I'm sure I will find a way to use every single port on the outs of that device very, very quickly. I always do. So that's sort of follow on from the rant last week, really. The next thing moving on to is, of course, if you followed the rant last week, System-8. I'm still have that very high on my list, to the point where I have actually put a pre-order in. So on the 24th of October, I think which is when it sort of arrives in the UK. Hopefully on the 25th of October it'll arrive in my house, or I'll go and pick it up. I'm not sure which way around it will be, but 24th, 25th is D-Day. So I've ordered my System-8, and I'll tell you what the turning point was. So last week I said I was really looking at it because it had the Jupiter 8 and it had the Juno 106 sound banks as part of the whole experience. They came with the machine itself. I think the thing that really made me sort of think about am I gonna buy it was the fact that I actually saw it also had a vocoder on it. And a vocoder facility. Now that to me just really sort of said, well, maybe they're going to do some of the other stuff that they did with the funky synths back in the day, with that vocoder functionality. So that was really what sold it for me when I saw that vocoder button on one of the demos that was done. I haven't seen anyone demo the vocoder piece yet, but the fact it has the functionality built in and it is in the specs has sort of moved me in that direction. The question, of course, is now what do I do with the System 1? Haven't put that one out yet, and to be honest, that can wait. The next piece of hardware to have a whinge about, really, this morning, seems to be I've had a whinge a couple of weeks, really, is hardware mixers, or mixers for the keyboard player. So I use, let me get this right, I use a Behringer Eurorack Pro in my studio as my mixer of choice. And the reason why I use that is it's a compact, it's a 1U unit, but it is stereo out of the gate, as in it has 16 inputs in 8 stereo groups. Okay, you have one button on the mixer itself to control the volume of each one of those stereo groups, and a left and right assign. Okay, so it really is a stereo mixer. And the reason why I bought that rather than having a desk is because I tended to find that the desks were A, expensive, and B, trying to get the levels right between two adjacent faders was an interesting. It's not difficult, but it's just requires some time, whereas this seems to work quite nicely for my requirements. It's not big enough for my requirements. I'd ideally like something with 16 stereo channel inputs, and this is what brings me on to the Rant. So when years ago, this is going back many years, there were keyboards manufacturers and sound manufacturers who were supporting the Keyboardist. Now there is a debate here, because if you're that sort of an Allen Heath or a Behringer or one of the other desk manufacturers, you're trying to appeal to the widest market, and I get that. Don't get me wrong. But in terms of the keyboard player, what the keyboard players really have, especially with the modern keyboards, with the older keyboards it wasn't so much. I mean, quite often you did have mono sources, and therefore one channel in was great. Doesn't work nowadays, because the keyboards themselves, to get that big soundscape that these keyboards push out, you really do need that stereo connectivity. Otherwise the soundscape just doesn't work. It doesn't work the same. And this is what the modern day keyboard is all about, is that sort of the soundscape that you can push out, and sound reinforcement for whatever you happen to be doing. And it gets even more worse than that, of course, once you start getting into the realms of film scoring and Dolby and all that sort of stuff, which, to be honest, I'm not really interested in at this point in time. So really, it sort of comes down to, you know, when is somebody going to sort of create a mixer that is more than 8 stereo channels, that was not necessarily a desk, that's big. You know, I mean, it'd be ideal if you could have a mixer that, say, for example, 16 stereo channels and 3U high in a rack. Now, I haven't seen one of those. I mean, I've seen various people over the last few weeks commenting about mixers on various forums. I mean, it seems to be a topic that is rumbling through. And one of the ones I had written down here was something called, which was the Samsung SM10, which the person in the article described as a 10-channel mixer. And I thought, oh great, that's a 10-channel stereo mixer. No, actually it's 10 channels. So, and it's not even 10 stereo channels. It's 10. It's 8 left and rights, if you like, plus 2 mic inputs. So, you know, effectively what it is a 4-channel stereo mixer with 2 mic inputs on it. So unfortunately that wasn't brilliant for what my requirements are. So again, it comes back to, you know, somebody out there, you know, I'll make the plea this week and see if I can find it next week. You know, somebody in that sort of sound world, create a decent quality mixer. For, you know, the keyboardist live on stage will want that behind him so he can hear his own mix, and for, you know, the studio person like me who's got lots and lots of tech, it would be actually nice if you could buy a desk that was purely stereo. You know, you didn't have to worry about having mono. You could just link the 2 faders together and say, okay, channel 1, you know, is a stereo channel, channel 2 is a stereo channel. And I can't believe that's beyond the realms of man now, given that these desks are going digital, and you can route and control all the functions and features digitally. So, you know, all you're effectively saying is I want 8 faders on the front and 16 inputs on the back. That would be absolutely fantastic. Or, you know, 16 inputs, 16 faders on the front with 32 inputs on the back, and then you could digitally route them. You know, that sort of thing would suit me down to the ground. Absolutely would. Anyway, so that's hardware mixers. Then moving on, this week I finally got around to doing some upgrade work on the stuff I've been meaning to upgrade for a while. So I've upgraded the MX-1 to the latest version of the software, which is the 1.04 firmware version. What's really interesting about this is I didn't realise there was an upgrade version available. But what it seems in the 1.4 version is they've now introduced surface controls for Ableton Live, which is really interesting. So, you know, you can control which tracks you're controlling with the buttons on the MX, and you also got key presses for starting and stopping the transport for recording, etc. I'm not 100% convinced with it, I have to be honest. I've looked at the way they've got the controls. So effectively you've got 11 faders across the MX-1 mixer, which gives you 11 scenes, as they put it, or 11 tracks on Ableton. So you have to page through the tracks to be able to move. So that's not too much of an issue from my perspective. But it's more to do with the fact that the usability of it as a surface, as opposed to as an extension of the computer and the mixer itself. Not sure. Jury is definitely out on that one. I might play around with it and see if I can work out how would it integrate into my workflow. Personal gut feel at the moment says no, it doesn't. But you know, I'm open to these things. And again, I wouldn't have known about the MX-1, the new version of the firmware for the MX-1, because I don't really watch the Roland site that often, if I hadn't decided that I was going to finally do the 606 upgrade for the TR-8. So that sort of moves me nicely on into the TR-8. So I've done a lot of this I've done a video about upgrading the TR-8 itself, because I think there are things that have to be said, but I'm going to give you the highlights anyway. So the highlight is that in order to put the 606 sounds on, you must have the 707 expansion pack installed on the TR-8, which is something I wasn't aware of. However, I am now aware of it because I've read the install notes. The second thing that comes up readily about it is that the firmware on the TR-8 on the drivers section of the Roland website is reporting a firmware version of 1.0 1.12, whereas the firmware for the 606 is now 1.2. So there has actually been a divergence in the firmware of the unit itself, away from the original firmware stack. And you can only get to the 1.2 firmware if you go via the expansion pack pages on the Roland website. So if you go to the drivers page, it doesn't display this information up for you. You have to go somewhere else to get it, which I think is very interesting. So there's obviously trying to stop you putting 1.2 on the machine because you haven't got the 707 expansion pack there. So really, this week is more of a week of getting back in touch with my keyboards, getting back in touch with my player. My friend Paula Penguin, who you sometimes see on photographs of me playing keyboards, has just gone back to school, and she is now actively learning keyboards. So I'm watching with interest what she's being taught, as opposed to what I was never taught. So yeah, that should be interesting. Maybe one day I'll get Paula Penguin to do a piece to camera so you can see it. She's got a lovely little bubbly thing. But yeah, so until next week, catch you later.